Anyone. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who's Allison Leigh. She is at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. She's an assistant professor of art history there, and she's going to be telling us about using digital art history to reassess the Catalogue Raisonné. Many thanks for your time, Allison. Over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the nice little introduction and being so dead set with the time. Thank you for organizing this, of course, more generally. I'm just getting my shared screen up, so hopefully you can all see my screen in terms of the PowerPoint now. And let me go ahead and put it in full screen mode.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Is that looking good? All right, excellent. Thank you so much. So, in late August or early September of 1882, the French painter Edouard Manet wrote a letter which is revealing in terms of his health and general outlook. Quote, "What a dreadful month, rain or wind every day. It doesn't make the countryside any more pleasant, especially for an invalid. I shall have to be very patient, seeing that I may extend my stay until the end of October. I'd like to try to come back somewhat recovered," end quote. Manet wrote this letter while recuperating from a decline in his health that most scholars believe resulted from syphilis, an affliction he had likely contracted some 15 or 20 years earlier. The importance of Manet's reference to himself as an invalid should not be underestimated. And yet the exact nature of the artist's increasing debility and its effect on his painting practice has never been clearly established. This is where I think the Catalogue Raisonné might come in. By utilizing this resource, a comprehensive listing of all the known artworks by Manet, I believe we might reassess the ways the artist's practice changed over time, taking a data-driven approach to evaluating what several art historians have referred to as Manet's decline. I began this project by taking the data from the Catalogue Raisonné, and I'm showing you now what that information looks like in the book itself, and I transferred it all, one entry at a time, into a very large and I will say rather painstaking spreadsheet, tracking in particular, as you can see, the size of the works, whether they were signed, the year they were completed, their format, their primary subject matter, and whether they were exhibited in the Paris Salon exhibition. In so doing, I hoped to establish more firmly than anyone else to date exactly the types of formal changes which took place in the painter's work in the last years of his life. Essentially, I tried to put a very old-fashioned resource like the Catalogue Raisonné in dialogue with digital humanities tools to reveal the specific ways Manet adapted his practice to accommodate the debilitating effects of syphilis. Now, scholars who assess Manet's final years generally tie his production of flower paintings like these to the disease he suffered from in the 1880s. Several further claim that these depictions of flowers represent a period of marked decline. The British art historian Douglas Cooper described them as, quote, "weak and flashy," and more recently, Carol Armstrong referred to them as, quote, "small-scale dalliance in a minor key." It is even more common for scholars to correlate the artist's illness with what they believe to be the diminishing size of his compositions. And I'm showing you now a very simplistic way of visualizing this by comparing two of his most famous Salon entries and showing them in relative scale to one another. In terms of this decline in the size of Manet's works, the art historian George Hurt Hamilton once stated that Manet was, quote, "obliged by the circumstances of his ill health to abandon large figural compositions," while other commentators have claimed that, quote, "his awkwardness and difficulty with handling the brushes forced him to paint small formats." This is where the Catalogue Raisonné and my spreadsheet come in. For if one evaluates Manet's paintings across his entire lifetime by constructing a large data pool like mine, it becomes clear that Manet was painting on almost exactly the same average scale in his last years as he had been at the outset of his career. The average size of his canvases from 1856 to 60, when he was in his mid-20s, was 58.6 square centimeters, while it was only just slightly smaller when he was increasingly debilitated between 1879 and 83. Similar results hold true for the 5-year period between 1871 and 75. His canvases were on average only about 5 centimeters larger than those from his final years. So it's not entirely true to say that Manet was, quote, forced to paint small formats because of his growing infirmity. This type of analytical evaluation can be used to debunk other misleading assertions, such as the claim that Manet's late salon paintings were smaller than those from his earlier years. And you see, I'm bringing back this slide now. Again, Carol Armstrong, among several others, asserts this when she states that a bar at the Folies Bergère, the painting you see on the right, is, quote, diminished in size compared to the painter's notorious salon paintings of the 1860s. While this statement is technically true, in that the salon works from his last 4 years were on average smaller than those specifically from the 1860s, this may be somewhat misleading in a larger sense. In fact, his salon paintings were almost exactly the same average size as those from 1873 to 74. This can be visualized another way. Here, I've scaled the figure of Manet to the size of his salon canvases to give a sense of their proportions in lived reality. For the figure of Manet, which you see a little in black and white on the left, I took the average male height for Frenchmen of the period, which was 5'5", and correlated that with statements from his contemporaries, which describe him constantly as being of medium stature. But what else might the data from the Catalogue Raisonné tell us? I want to return to these late flower paintings now, for it's this cluster of works that has most often been specifically referred to as symptomatic of his declining health. If you separate these out from the rest of his production, what you discover, however, is not as simple as it seems. In 1864, Manet produced 6 renderings of peonies. You can see them, I'll show them now across the top of the slide. And these collectively averaged 53 square centimeters. When Manet returned to flower depiction between 1877 and 83, the canvases averaged 53.4, almost exactly the same overall scale. Similarly, the quote unquote smaller late flower paintings, which are commonly taken as evidence of his weakening, prove not to be greatly different in scale from the larger body of still life paintings to which they belong. Manet produced some 45 of these over the course of his entire career, and taken all together, they average a little over 48 square centimeters. The 25 flower paintings he made are actually slightly larger than the accumulated still lifes by almost 5 centimeters. Thus, in terms of their scale, the flower paintings should simply be considered on par with Manet's larger still life practice. They are not qualitatively different from the larger body of paintings that depicted flora and fauna and spanned the entirety of the artist's productive years. In fact, the comprehensive data reveals that the flowers he portrayed between 1881 and 83, when he was the most incapacitated, actually grew larger in overall average scale every single year. The flower paintings he made in his final year are also on average larger than the still lifes he made in not just 1861, 69, and 72, but also 76, 77, and 80. All this disproves the notion that illness and scale should be so directly correlated. Systematic assessments of this variety can be used to productively formulate other breakthroughs regarding the years when Manet was increasingly impaired. Evaluating the format of his canvases demonstrates that a dramatic shift began in the second half of the 1870s. Between 1863 and 74, Manet painted most of his canvases in a horizontal format, some 61%. But then after 1875, which was the year that his close friends reported he began to have severe pain in his legs, the percentage of horizontal canvases decreases sharply. The decline in this number, in fact, falls most precipitously between 1876 and 77. As you can see, if I switch to a chart which maps slightly differently the percentage of Manet's works that were painted in a horizontal format, whereas 60% of his canvases were horizontal in 1876, that number drops to only 8% the following. This is one of the sharpest declines in his entire career. Now we know that Manet was forced to paint from a seated position increasingly in his last years. A fellow painter reported Manet's apologies for not standing up when he visited his studio in 1882. Quote, "He recognized me at once, held out his hand and said, 'I'm so sorry, please forgive me. I must remain seated. I'm having difficulties with my foot.'" Such accounts make it clear why Manet was forced to increasingly why he was forced to increasingly turn to the vertical format. Painting from a seated position would have made it easier for him to adjust the canvas perpendicularly, using a lever like this period easel has, as opposed to having to stand and move his chair each time he needed to paint a different section of a large horizontal work. Yet while he may have been forced to paint more in the vertical format, the data also shows a tremendous surge in productivity at the end of his life. Just when one might expect his illness to have forced him to reduce the amount he worked, Manet pushed against such circumstances and ramped up his production. Between 1879 and 83, Manet made 139 paintings, more than at any other time in his life. In fact, the next nearest 5-year period is dramatically far from the rate at which he began canvases in his last years. Further, averaging all the years of his work before his illness reveals that Manet produced about 11 paintings a year, thus making his last full year of painting in 1882 an increase of 230% compared to his normal average rate. We should keep in mind that in that last full year, when he made more paintings than in just about any other, he was undergoing painful treatments in the summers, and he was barely able to walk unassisted. Without question, such astonishing productivity should recalibrate our sense of what an artist who is suffering from a painful debility can achieve. Too often, art historians have assumed that in the case of Manet, the work produced under conditions of impairment must necessarily represent a decline. Among Manet scholars, this meant positing theories that his paintings became smaller, that his subject matter was lesser, and that his production declined. But the reality is that Manet fought the effects of his disability and adapted in subtle ways to his condition so that he might prolong his ability to work. I want to share one last data point with you. For assessing Manet using digital art history tools reveals one more truth. If one takes a signature as confirmation that a painting was finished, then it becomes clear from this graph that Manet completed fewer and fewer works towards the end of his life. As you can see, the downturn began after 1875, again, the year when Manet began to have that pain in his legs. So as much as the painter was producing works at an, sorry, I just saw the 3 minutes. I promise I won't go over time. I'm finishing up now. So as much as the painter was producing works at an unprecedented rate in his last years, He was either not satisfied with what he was making enough to sign it, or he was unable to bring his paintings to the state of resolution he had in earlier years. Thus, the reality of Manet's condition did have effects, which forced him to adapt his practice, but not in ways that have been properly accounted for by scholars. What I hope all this has shown is that we should not presume. We should not rely on common theories and deductions, especially those that suppose an illness like the one Manet suffered from caused his work to decline. We now have the digital technologies that allow us to make new discoveries about even the most prominent artists. The holistic data analysis performed here might help scholars uncover further truths, and it might help us all see Manet himself better. For his case shows that despite extraordinary impediments, artists have a remarkable capacity to adapt, even in the face of terrible pain. Thank you.